All right, everybody, find your seats. We're going to start in just a second. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wende Museum's A-Frame Theater. Yes. God, that feels good. I do that all the time, but it still feels good. I know you're clapping for the theater and not for me, but I still would like to pretend. That's actually in theme with our discussion tonight. This must be what it feels like for totalitarian leaders. I get it, guys. We're delighted to have all of you here for a conversation that sits right at the heart of our mission by exploring stories about how politics, power, and people are told and who gets to tell them. So tonight's program centers on Julia Ioffe's new book, Motherland, A Feminist History of Modern Russia, which is a really ambitious and incredible reframing of Russia's past and its present through this lens of the lives, labor, and leadership of women. So our guest, Julia Ioffe, is one of the most incisive journalists writing about Russia, geopolitics, history, and the information ecosystems that are shaping our world. She was born in Moscow and raised here in the US, where she began her career at The New Yorker. A few of you might have heard of that, and has since reported and written for The Atlantic, The New Republic, GQ, The Washington Post, and most recently Puck, where she's a founding partner and marquee correspondent. With Motherland, Julia brings together both her fluency and deep understanding of Russian culture and politics and society in a sweeping human story that traces how women have shaped revolutions and regimes, war and work, culture and care, and how those histories reverberate far beyond Russia's borders, which we're going to hear about tonight. And guiding the conversation is Franklin Leonard, the founder and CEO of The Blacklist, the platform that began as an annual survey of Hollywood's best unproduced screenplays and grew into a global talent pipeline, reshaping how stories reach the screen. He's a champion of original voices and rigorous ideas, and he'll bring clarity and curiosity to the conversation that we're going to have today. And together they will both connect the dots between journalism and storytelling, propaganda, and the power of the narrative, which is so much something that is, I would say, universal. And so what we're going to hear in some ways, and I thought about this when I was thinking about what to say tonight, the way in which humans are more alike than they're different, and how many times in so many ways the sort of the connective tissue between these things and how much of these stories are deeply human ones. And I want to also mention that this book, which has just come out, which is amazing, I'm a proud owner of one. You should be too. She will be doing the book signing after a 1-hour conversation, which will have the last 15 minutes of it will be Q&A. And join us outside in the garden for a glass of wine. After what we're here tonight, we will all need a glass of wine. I'll be right there with you, looking out for you. I'm so proud to have these guests with us today. This is such a wonderful partnership with Skirball, who brought this opportunity to us, and my friend Jesse Kornberg. And so please join me now in welcoming Julia Ioffe and Franklin Leonard. Thanks, guys.
Good evening, everyone. Julia, thank you for having me do this, by the way. It's a tremendous honor.
Thank you for connecting me to Skirball, which connected me to the Wende Museum.
Yeah, shout out to Jesse, by the way.
And thank you for being a very old and dear friend. So thank you for doing this.
It's true. We've been friends for just about 10 years now, which is roughly, I think, the story of the book.
Yeah, it's about...
Well, I mentioned that because it's been fun just via a group chat to sort of see the full story of it. And this being Hollywood, I felt like it was probably a good thing to start with origin stories. Why this book? What made you write it?
My agent.
See, I knew that, which is expand on
that.
On that.
She also told me to stop saying that, but I won't. So I wanted to write about a book about Russia, and I didn't want to write about Putin. I wanted to write around him, and I wanted to mention him as infrequently as possible because I was so sick of him. I saw some kids in the audience, so I'm going to do my best with my potty mouth. I was so sick of writing about him, thinking about him, and it felt like every TV appearance, every piece I was asked to write was, what does Vladimir Putin really want? Or what does Vladimir Putin really think? And I was so sick of it.
I mean, I was guilty of asking you that in the group chat, so apologies.
It's fine. It's allowed. But I just didn't want to then commit myself to a book about him. And I also felt like he had had enough books written about him, and I was bored of him. So my agent kept saying, you have these incredible women in your family. Your mom's a doctor. Her mom's a doctor. Her mom was a doctor. You should write about these extraordinary women in your family. And I would say to her, they're not at all extraordinary. I have Russian friends who were close to the Solzhenitsyns or had famous family members who actually were extraordinary in the context of Soviet and Russian history, and my people just weren't. They were just average Soviet people. And I was like, it's going to be a very short book if it's about them. But then I realized that to an American, it is extraordinary that I had two great-grandmothers who were doctors in the 1930s and one who ran a lab in the 1930s. And to explain to an American audience why that was ordinary isn't, like, that in and of itself is extraordinary. That story is extraordinary. And I realized when I started researching the book that I didn't know the story. And so this is also me learning what, hey, Rose. No. It's just fun to see friends from Moscow walk in. This was also me learning about that history. Having studied Soviet history in college and written about Russia for now, 20 years, I did not know who these people were. I didn't know much about the Bolshevik feminist experiment or why my great-grandmothers were doctors and scientists. And the more I learned, the more I was like, do other people know this? So I kept sending chapters and sections to my parents, to friends who I made when we were all correspondents in Russia, because I wanted it to be for an American audience to tell them this extraordinary story, but I also wanted it to still be interesting for people who care about Russia, know about Russia. And to my surprise, a lot of them didn't know this story. And then that's when I started getting really mad.
I'm curious actually how, like, as you're doing this research, so you have, like, you know that you're roughly the story you want to tell, and in the research and familiarizing yourself with that and then doing this iterative process of sharing it and getting feedback about what people know and what people don't know, I'm curious how the sort of scope, thesis, and general thrust of the book changed in the writing of it.
Well, first I didn't know, how to give this thing shape at all. Because I just, my editors wanted more personal history, more family history. I felt that was, the documentation for that was pretty thin. I just had oral histories. And I also realized that I had to situate them in something to explain, why my grandparents as children had to be evacuated from Moscow in 1941. I had to explain, who was I had to situate them in the history. And I didn't want to make that boring and to just be like, in 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. And then I had a moment actually on the sidelines of a conference in Aspen where I ran into Nina Khrushcheva, who is Nikita's great-granddaughter, and is a professor at the New School. And I was interviewing her. I was like, great, you're here. I'm going to talk to you about your family. And she said something that really stuck with me and gave me the kind of skeleton, the through line of the book. She said, have you noticed that the fate of the Soviet first ladies or the wives of the leaders reflect the fate of the country at large? And I thought, bingo, that's how I'm going to create shape narrate the context, the historical context, into which I then drop my family. So then there's the kind of through line at the top, which is the stories of Lenin's wife, Stalin's wives, etc. And through them, I try to tell the big history, what happened, not just to women, but the country at large. And then the line kind of running underneath that is my family, the ordinary people. And kind of weaving those two things together is also what took so long.
You mentioned that sort of as you're doing the research and the work, like it made you very mad. One of the things that I've always really admired, both about your writing and I think your public persona, is how you never sacrifice emotion for sort of actual work of journalism. And I'm curious if you could talk about balancing that in the course of sort of telling this sort of, a fact-based history of a century of Russian history, incorporating the very human story, like there's human stories at the top level, but there's your family story sort of running throughout it. Thank you very much. Is that better?
Yep.
Great. So I was asking about emotionality in the writing and balancing the emotion of the human story, the factual sort of journalistic work of recounting a century's worth of history. How did you think about that in the writing of it?
Well, throughout my career, I've had fellow journalists or sources, usually were always men, saying, "Wow, your writing's kind of emotional." And it was never ever a compliment, right? And it would make me embarrassed about it. It would make me want to tone it down and do the kind of baronial New York Times style, racially charged comments kind of line. And then I heard about Svetlana Alexievich when she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2015, and I had never heard of her. So I picked up Secondhand Time, which is her kind of epic chronicling the collapse of the Soviet Union through basically these curated oral histories. And it really is an emotional history. She describes, I think people have quibbled with her about, she's combined character, like real people into one person, et cetera. But I think what was so incredible for me about that book and all her other books is that they're emotional histories. She tells you what it felt like to live through historical cataclysm. And I was like, this is what I was looking for. I had been a lover of history my whole life, and I always wanted to kind of place myself in it and imagine what it must have been like to live through various historical epochs, because they're all people. People are essentially the same. And, whether you're living in the Roman Empire or the Qing dynasty or in Putin's Russia. And I got really annoyed with that commentary, as if, what I found amazing about Svetlana Alexievich's work is that she showed that emotion is a valid form of information. And it's, in fact, an incredibly important type of information, right? And it's why irrational behavioral economics is having such a field day, right? Because it turns out we're not rational actors. It turns out we make a lot of our decisions based on emotion rather than on rational self-interest and just cold, hard facts. And you don't have to make stuff up. A lot of times, the reality is much more rage-inducing or happiness-inducing, whatever, pick your emotion, than something you make up. But I felt like picking up Svetlana's books, Alexievich's books, I have never met her, we're not on a first-name basis, but she, gave me permission to write emotionally, and I feel like that has really resonated with people about this book, that people have felt that they can immerse themselves in it and feel what it may have felt like to live through historical cataclysm, which is no small thing, I think.
What was the thing that made you, was there a moment that you felt like you had to dial back the rage?
Two moments. So the first moment was when I started writing the chapter about Beria, Stalin's number two, who oversaw the Gulag, the secret police, and then the Soviet nuclear program, and was just a sadist, sociopath, evil through and through. And he was known throughout the Soviet Union, and especially among people who lived in Moscow, that he plucked young girls off the street and brought them back to his house and raped them. He plucked women off the silver screen and said, you're beautiful. And some of them said, I'm married. And he would say, no problem, have their husbands arrested and shot. And I found almost nothing in the history books about this. It was at best, an aside, a parenthetical, maybe a footnote or an endnote. And the male historians who kind of flicked at this clearly saw it as something gross and prurient and salacious and gossipy and kind of tabloidy and unserious. And so, and I got very angry at a point where I was like, one of his main victims, who became a kind of concubine and with whom he had a child, I found one of her former lovers. And it was not very hard to find him. And he told me a bunch of stuff about her, including that she died in 2014. So all the years I lived in Moscow as a correspondent, a lot of the years I was traveling back and forth to report on it, she was there. And she may have talked to me. But because I was under this delusion that I have to write about serious things without emotion, i.e. the things men find serious, I had missed this incredible opportunity. And then the second part and I was really mad at these historians, and a couple editors were like, let's just, because I called some of them up too, and I was like, can you talk to me about this? And they're like, well, we don't really know. And it kind of unsaid was, I don't know that we really care.
Wait, so it was really just even dismissed when it was raised as a clearly you know more about this, what can you tell me?
Yeah, well, they were like, well, there's not really evidence, there was evidence, or there is evidence, and the archives used to be open, but nobody cared, right? And the stuff that does exist, that has already been published by a couple of Russian historians, they're like, well, these are just official interrogation documents, official testimonies. We know how those are. I'm like, yeah, but Robert Conquest in his genre-defining book about the Great Terror quotes interrogation testimonies, et cetera, even though they were obtained under torture, et cetera, with that caveat at length, right? He treats them as the historical documents they are. There's a way to treat these, if you're a real historian, you know how to treat documents. And there was this kind of it's not serious. And we don't really have much evidence. And and what pissed me off was you had the evidence was there. All the survivors were around. They talked about it. They wrote books about it. They tried to tell Western journalists about it in the 90s when everything opened up, and just nobody cared to listen. And yeah, that made me really mad. It makes me mad now.
I mean, same. And that was one, or that was both?
Oh no. So the second thing.
Not to dwell in your anger, but
let's just get mad. So the second thing was writing about, again, most of the stuff I had no idea about. But in 1944, World War II is raging, but it's clear that the Soviet Union is beating back the Nazis on the Eastern Front. It's clear they're going to win. And they're Stalin and his lieutenants are starting to make a post-war plan. And they know that they've lost a lot of people, millions and millions and millions of people. And they're like, we need to repopulate the country. We need to, in their terms, replace the dead. And there were no men around to do it. So it was on the women to replace the dead that the men had killed. And they introduce all these reforms and laws and measures to engineer a baby boom. And they did it. Like, they had a little baby boom, but it was so cruel, like everything else they did. Basically, they unraveled a lot of the old Bolshevik reforms of 1918, 1920. Divorce became almost impossible to obtain. So what few men there were left and were married were locked into those marriages. But women were incentivized to have children. They now had less time for their education, according to the new government rules. They and the men were taxed if they did not have children. You continued being taxed if you had one child and even two children. You only stopped paying the tax if you had three children. So if you replace the mother, the father, and add one body to the coffer, essentially. They introduced medals of motherhood, different military-style ranks for women who had astronomical numbers of children, the highest being 10 children. And in explaining how you get these honors, they're like, we'll count the children who died fighting in the Great Fatherland War toward this number, which was, quite the little twist. And those medals, they got that idea from Nazi Germany. So one of the other reforms that the Bolsheviks introduced in 1918 was allowing women to get child support from men who had impregnated them, even if they were not married. They did away with that. So basically, they incentivized men who were married to other women to impregnate women who were not their wives, as many as possible. But the women could not put that man's name on the birth certificate. They were not allowed to seek child support from them. And the state would kind of step in loco parentis and be the father, which it did imperfectly. But basically, it created this new social and legal category of the single mother. And the state worked really hard to decrease the stigma around them, et cetera. It's still omnipresent in Russia. I've never seen so many single mothers as in Russia. And it was just such a hey, the men messed this up. We made all these decisions and it wasn't just the war, right? Between 1914 and 1945, or not just World War II, between 1914 and 1945, over 50 million Soviets died, were killed violently, usually. And through political repression, civil war, collectivization, man-made famines, and women had no part in that decision-making process. But they had to come in and clean up the mess by making more children who would be soldiers for the next war, right? And when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the third time I got super mad was when everybody was like, oh, well, the Russian mothers will come out and protest. And when the body bags start coming, the Russian wives and mothers will make the Kremlin end this war. And I was like, why? They didn't start the war. They have zero political power. But it's on them again to save the country from the men messing it up constantly.
I feel like the sort of post-World War II reforms are particularly ironic given the number of women who were a part of the Russian military, hundreds of thousands of them. Can you talk a little, because especially in this moment where America is reconsidering the role of women in the military, can you talk a little bit about what the role of women was in the military in Russia in World War II, and sort of, we talked about what followed from that, but just make the point that this was doubly ironic for me, I suppose is what I'm asking.
No, absolutely. Because basically the gates slammed shut on women's emancipation in the Soviet Union, such as it had been. The first post-Soviet, let me go forward and then back. Over 800,000 Soviet women, mostly young girls, mostly teenage girls, fought in active combat in World War II. They were snipers, they were fighter pilots, there were several all-female squadrons. They were officers, they were artillery gunners, they were paratroopers, they did everything. And the reason is because so Lenin's wife, who was really into educational theory, was really influenced by Horace Mann, introduced co-ed education in the Soviet Union. And in the process of educating girls and boys together, they were also all given paramilitary training, because this is the 20s and 30s, everyone's getting ready for war. So girls and boys are learning how to shoot in first, second, third grade together, side by side. They're getting lectures on military history, side by side. In order to progress in their education, in order to get into college, they need to learn how to jump from a parachute stand and how to work with a tractor or a plane engine, how to read a topographical map. My grandmother, who had to go to medical school, which is a long story, at 36 with 2 young kids, had to pass a biodefense and other kind of war stuff in her medical school training. And so when the war hit, when the war came, all these young women had been brought up to be soldiers. And so when these 16, 17, 18-year-old girls swarm the recruitment posts, they have government certificates saying that they are good snipers, that they can jump from airplanes, that they can fly airplanes. And what's incredible is the very few histories we have of this, like you can count on one hand and you wouldn't get all the fingers. When you talk to when scholars and people like Svetlana Alexievich talk to these women, they don't see themselves as doing anything male. They don't see themselves as women acting like men. They're just being themselves, and it's not anything a woman can't do. They're just being people. And even more so, they're, after bombing Nazis all day or shooting them in no man's land from your sniper's nest, then they come home to their dugout and they steal hydrogen peroxide from the medical tent to dye their hair, or make themselves a necklace from a parachute. Like, they're still, again, they don't see any of this as in conflict with their femininity. And thinking about this in the context of the current debate in the US, I'm like, what are we talking about? And I think it's obviously it's on purpose. They want this gender divide. And you know who was really freaked out by this female soldiers? The Nazis, who were incredibly heteronormative, were obsessed with keeping this line between men and women, men's roles and women's roles so deeply etched. The psychological value of the psychological warfare of the Nazis, knowing that there were 16-year-old girls taking their guys out with the same shot, like with a shot to the same spot between the guy's eyes, drove them nuts. They didn't know, it terrorized them, which I love, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be terrified of 16-year-old women with sniper guns and training. Like,
yeah.
I've got nieces. Like, they're terrifying under the right circumstances. I mean, it's interesting as an American, right? I think probably because of Putin a little bit, I think we have this notion of Russia being this hyper-masculine culture. And I think in reading this book, you begin, like, I mean, you're certainly interrogating it and certainly saying, maybe there's actually another interpretation of sort of the Russian identity. I'm curious if this notion of hyper-masculinity that is sort of the Russian brand now, is that something organic? Is it curated forgetting? Like, what is that?
It's both. So all the reforms I describe in the beginning of the book were met with tremendous resistance from men and women who didn't want this. And women, kind of missionaries of the communist cause, of the Zhenadel, which was the women's section of the Communist Party, they sent young women with their signature red kerchiefs out into the countryside to explain how the new regime was going to emancipate them, and they'd get killed. And it wasn't just the men who didn't want any part of this. so when Stalin comes back and comes in and gets rid of a lot of these emancipatory reforms and says, no, we're doing strict heteronormativity, we're doing nuclear family, which Lenin, Kollontai, all the Bolsheviks tried to dismantle as the building block of capitalism. He was like, no, we're doing that again. And because only one generation had passed and it had already met so much resistance, including in the party hierarchy, which was all male or mostly male, people were like, okay, fine. And then on top of that, I think the hypermasculinity that you're seeing now is aspirational. It's like manifesting what you want. Because if you look at, and if any of you have ever been to Russia, what you see is, as one sociologist told me, people might say that Russian women are prostitutes or whatever, but it's still a positive cultural brand. Russian men, you don't want to be a Russian man. They're slovenly, they're drunken, they're useless, they're overgrown man-children, they die young. I mean, the current age gap or the current life expectancy gap between Russian men and women is about 10 years, which is actually much better than it's been for a long time. So this idea that Russia is macho is aspirational for them. And the reason Vladimir Putin rides around shirtless on a horse is for that, and it's for the Russian women who have never had a man like him.
So that was the other thing I thought was really interesting. I can't remember which interview you talked about this, but yeah, that it's not just Russian men that are sort of backing this hyper-masculine image. It's Russian women that are embracing it. Can you talk a little bit about why? Because they've been asked to carry the country on their backs forever. By the time the Soviet Union fell apart and the Soviet experiment ended, Russian women were working a full day at work. Then they were coming home to do 7 hours per day of domestic labor in an largely unmechanized household. So no vacuum cleaner, no dishwasher, no washing machine, no groceries, no clothes. So while the husband did nothing. The 90s made it even worse. And Russian women are just tired, and they want, seeing these images from the West of single income households where a woman can just stay at home and the man can go out and work and bring home the money and she can just focus on herself. This is their wildest fantasy now. But it's an unachievable one because Russian men die young. A lot of them are alcoholic. They're seen as, because of all the coddling they've received over the generations, because they were such an endangered species after the war, there were places where there were 100 women to every 19 men, and villages where one man would come back and that guy's wife passed him around to all the other women so that they could have children. I'm not kidding. This is what happened, right? So men were seen as the scarce resource to be coddled and protected. That did not go well for the men. Shocking.
Right. And so for women, I asked this washed-up pop star that I interviewed, what she thinks of. She was hilarious, but I asked her what she thinks of Putin. And she leans into me and she goes, I bet you. She's like, for me and for 70% of Russian women, he is the subject of our moistest fantasies. And I was like, but it's because they have never had a man like him. He doesn't drink. He exercises. He is disciplined. He is in control. He's clearly rich,
Just finally someone's gonna do something.
Yeah, he's decisive. He is their kind of Ubermensch. And they are the soldiers in his patriarchal regime. Go anywhere, any cashier, any administrator, the school principals who are stuffing the ballot boxes because the schools are the voting precincts. You have these middle-aged school principals who are rigging the voter rolls, like in front of you, stuffing the ballot boxes in front of you. They know what they're doing. The judges, most judges are women. All these judges who are handing out, Nadia Tolakonyakova is here. She can tell you about the woman judge in her case, handing out these insane prison sentences for political cases. They're all women. They are the foot soldiers in his patriarchy.
Your family's Jewish heritage figures prominently in the book. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that thread and why it was important that you include it.
Well, because it was, I guess intersectionality is out now, but this is...
Y'all can see why we're friends.
But I started this book in 2018, so it's like I was grandfathered in. Anyway, but it was just another layer of our Soviet existence or our story, and it was not, you can't tell the story of our family history in Russia and the Soviet Union without also telling the history of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's why this book, why we're sitting here today, why I speak English better than I speak Russian, why this book was written in English, is because of the Russian and Soviet legacy of state anti-Semitism that my family increasingly felt that there was no future for us in Russia, and because Russia didn't want people like us. And now looking at it where you have, priests sprinkling soldiers and tanks with holy water before they are sent off to fight in Ukraine, I'm like, yeah, that was a good choice.
One of the other things that's just incredible about this book is just how ambitious the scope is. Like anytime we're talking about 100 years, 100 plus years of history, even as long as it is, I think it's inevitable that there are places that you can't go further because it's just so big. Yeah. And knowing you, I know this book could have been twice or 3 times as long without sacrificing its quality at all. I'm curious, what were you not able to go deeper on that you kind of wish you had?
I think some of the kind of side stories of relatives and cousins who all had crazy stories, there was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor, and I think I just forgot about it instantly because...
It's probably healthy.
Yeah, I remember being a fact checker, my first job out of college, and I remember watching the writers who were just so precious about cuts, and I was like, never be like that. It's just like, nobody knows what gets cut, just be a pro and roll with it. But it was hard to end the book because the story keeps going. And I will say that when my agent and when editors at various publishing houses kept saying, this is the book, right? Because I had a sample chapter that was just going to be a chapter about Russian women. They were like, this is the book. The book is about Russian women. And I found myself saying, no, I want to write a serious book. And like the internalized misogyny is so real. And I was like, I want to write a serious book. This isn't serious. This is like soft social history. And then you realize, oh, it's half the population. It's just the history of the thing. And so anything is Russian history. Anything is a story about the politics. I was just at speaking to a class at NYU, and Evgenia Albats, who was the professor of this class and is in the book, was like, oh, why didn't you write about this person? Or would you write about this person in the next version? I'm like, it has to end somewhere. Like, a lot of people happen to be women, and it's half the population. So it could have gone in every direction, and there were parts where I had to reel myself back in. So
we have this thing in Hollywood called sequels. Marvel story universes. There's opportunities for expansion. Is the book's not available in Russia?
No, it's not.
But is it available in Russia?
So I reached out to a friend who runs a small publishing house, but from exile. She can't be there. And she was like, there's no chance. There's no way. I mean, no chance is me translating from the Russian, but she was like, there's no way. It has feminist in the subtitle. And they are literally going into bookstores and seizing Susan Sontag's books and confiscating them. Like, there's no way.
Right.
We're working on it now, and we have some interesting possibilities for translating this book into Russian by publishing houses in exile. So basically, we're in the year of our Lord 2025, and we have to revert again to Tamizdat.
Right.
And but for a while, it looked like nothing was going to come through, and I was like, screw it. I'll pay for the translation. I'll make it free. I just want to get it into the country. But we'll see what happens.
I'm curious. This is like
sorry, I don't think in talking to Nadia for this book, she was like, "Thank you for writing this book because I think a lot of Russians don't know this history, and I would like them to know this."
This is sort of what I was asking about. I'm curious. This is leg 2 of the book tour. It's only been out for a week and a half now. Is that right? I'm curious if you've detected a difference in how it is received by Americans who have no personal connection to Russia and then members of the Russian diaspora.
I think the members of the Russian diaspora, from what I've seen, find it to be an incredibly emotional and painful read. They see themselves and their families reflected in this because they all have mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers like this, which underscores my thesis that there is nothing really special about the women in my family. They were just living in extraordinary times. But it's been interesting to see so many people with roots in the place or people who were born there say like, oh my God, this is my family's history, both on the Jewish side and just the broader Soviet Russian side. And that's been really, really heartening to hear.
Let's talk a little bit about the future and then we'll open it up to questions. Your pinned tweet on Twitter used to be "Tomorrow will be worse." Another way I knew we would be friends immediately. You were close with Alexei Navalny. And Julia obviously had remained largely behind the scenes when he was still alive, but has sort of come into, I think, into public view since his death. I'm curious what you make of how she's doing.
So I wouldn't say I was close with him. I would say I wrote about him, and a lot of my friends were friends with him, and I took his murder to be, I took it very, very personally, just because I realized I had assumed that he was Russia's future. And he was for all of us, I think it was like, tomorrow will be worse, but maybe the day after tomorrow will be better because of him. With all his warts and problems, still any day and Sunday over Vladimir Putin. Julia is tough. She, on one hand, was always a kind of behind-the-scenes advisor, supporter, and from what I heard from other people, kind of grudge keeper. I think she doesn't have his natural talent. When you met him, it was like, oh, is this what a young Bill Clinton was like, or a young Barack Obama was like? Like, he had the thing. It was insane and it was unmistakable, and that happens once in a generation if you're lucky.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't happen twice in the same family. But so she doesn't have his warmth, his charisma, his kind of natural talents and natural instincts for politics, but few people did. On the other hand, I think so I don't know how successful she's going to be. On the other hand, she has a problem set that is much more difficult than he ever had. She is not in the country. Neither are many of her supporters. People who are still in the country and support her and her late husband's cause are now facing charges, could face charges that they're extremists and terrorists and go to jail for potentially life. And if Alexei had kind of a concentration of followers in Moscow and the cities, now they're kind of scattered to the four corners of the world. There are people in Tel Aviv and in Lisbon and in London and in New York and Berlin. And how do you make a movement out of that? When you can't even, it's getting harder to make phone calls into Russia. It's an impossible, I feel like her task is to keep the flame alive until some kind of black swan event or something massive changes.
Is there anything that you're looking for, or that we sort of as external observers can track as an indication of things changing for the better or worse?
I think traditionally the Russian economy. I saw something recently that the Russian economy is stalling. It roared back to life with the war and the insane levels of military spending that the government had unleashed, which interestingly, given the cash payouts to soldiers, the highest rates of inflation were in the poorest parts of Russia, because that's who was going to fight, and these areas were just getting inundated with cash. Now it looks like the military is drastically dialing back those payments. The economy is kind of stalling a little bit. But, there's this source I talked to who is in those circles, and he's like, is there a famine? No. Has there been a nuclear war unleashed? No. Are there mass political repressions where millions are going to jail? No. He's like, so we're fine. That's the level, and I think the fact that Putin has glorified and cultified World War II to the extent that he has, if 27 million war dead is your marker for what it takes to win a good war, then the ceiling's pretty high. So I would say the Russian economy, to answer your question, and Putin's health. But he, as you know, he was caught in a hot mic with Xi Jinping in Beijing talking about how he's exploring all these technologies to live to 150 with infinite organ transplants.
Which I feel like is also not uncommon amongst all billionaires right now. So
right. Yeah, he's very au courant.
Yeah. All right, questions. I'm sure there are many, because Lord knows I could go for another few hours. There's a mic right here, and you're right there next to the microphone, so I'm going to give you question number one.
The pressure. Hi. First of all, thank you so much for writing this book. I'm just starting part 2, and you and I share the same history. Born in Moscow, 7, etc. Same background, everything. Also, I think we were in Moscow the same year as early 2000s. Yeah, hanging out with Peter Pomerantsev and all that.
No, he was before my time.
Okay, all right. But so my question is, when do you think you'll feel safe going back to Moscow? Because I struggle with this too. I haven't been back since 2004. And I'm terrified to ever go again until while Putin is alive. I feel like we'll all get thrown in jail.
Yeah.
Do you have that same?
Yeah. For the first few months after the full-scale invasion, that was the question I asked everybody: was when do you think we'll get to go back? Because it was clear that the doors had slammed shut, and I remember asking David Remnick, my first boss, about this, and he said, I don't think I'll ever get to go again. He was like, it won't be in my lifetime. I do have a source in Moscow that's pretty high up, and for a long time he was like, you should come, what's the problem? And he was like, listen, I talked to and Lavrov will guarantee that nothing happens to you. I was like, Lavrov can't guarantee shit. Like, Lavrov found out 24 hours before the invasion that the invasion was happening. Like, then I woke up one day to find that Evan Gershkovich had been arrested. And the first call I made was to that source. And I was like, so you still think I should come? He's like, yeah, what's the problem? And he was like, he was just breaking the rules. You're not gonna break the rules, you should come. And, which is also like an old trick. But yeah, I don't even know that after Putin dies. Because I think Putinism, like Stalinism, has legs, like Trumpism. I think these movements can live a long life after their progenitor has died at 150. But I hope to, like you'll see it in the book, like it is, I miss it so much. And I want so badly to go back just to see what this society has become, to see this dystopia. Nina Khrushcheva goes back all the time, and I think she's protected by her name. But she'll text me from there and say, Yulia, мне так страшно. She's like, I'm so scared. Like, I hear footsteps in the hall, and I'm like, great, they're coming for me. Like, that's the level it's at.
I can probably talk without a mic, right? So, a question for you, because I was fascinated with your description of men and women over there, and I've never been there. My wife was born in Ukraine and Jewish, and so I'm curious about this because her mom ran a textile factory, but her dad was an engineer, and all the men that came over, that came in '79, are incredibly hardworking men. So is that anomalous? Is that because they were fighting anti-Semitism? What would...
Well,
I'm just curious where the distinction would come.
I think it's immigration, right? It's immigrants are generally really hardworking. They made the choice to come, and once they come, they work really hard. But in the 1990s, what sociologists observed happening in Russia is when everything collapsed and the factories shut down and the mines shut down, and all the jobs went away, or there were months-long wage arrears, the men basically lay down on the couch and complained that there was no work and refused to take lower status work because male status in most societies is seen as quite rigid. So the idea that you're an engineer or a factory foreman that then washes toilets or is a gypsy cab driver, your status will never recover, and so you can't. And a lot of men just lay down on the couch and drank and complained and died. The women whose status is seen as more plastic and who were, the children were their primary responsibility, they did not have that option. So you had school principals and doctors washing toilets and going to Turkey and China to schlep cheap clothes to sell at the markets and chop chicken parts. They were the ones who worked hard. But immigrants are a special thing. It's like, I have a close Nigerian friend. And I was like, oh my God, is everyone from Nigeria a genius neurosurgeon? And he was like, no, those are just the immigrants. Like, Nigerians are regular people, but the immigrants that have self-selected, they're different.
Their kids all have 5 PhDs.
Yeah, correct.
In my experience. Other questions? Right on the aisle. Yep, no, you, yep.
Thank you very much for writing this book, so I'm looking forward to reading it. You mentioned that you started to work on the book in 2018, 4 years before the Russian large-scale invasion in Ukraine. And I wonder in which way that impacted your writing process. Perhaps you added some additional chapters, you decided to omit some others. So if there is any impact of this large-scale invasion in Ukraine on the final book and your final manuscript. Thank you.
Yeah, so the book had to keep going, and I had to add another chapter, which ended up being 3 chapters. But it also restricted my ability to travel and and do more research for the book. It scattered a lot of people I know. It's in the book, kind of also what happens to my own family, but yeah, I had to add chapters about, again, this idea that the women will save us. The women will save the country from the men and from itself. And I also kind of take that apart, but yeah.
I think we have probably time for two more. Two more. Right here.
I just want to say thank you for writing this book. This speaks to me. I want to say you said your family, your women in your family were ordinary or like everybody else, but there's nothing ordinary about them. They were physicians. They were working in the lab. They were Jewish in Moscow, of all places. Can you talk a little bit more about that? That was far greater than ordinary.
I disagree. I mean, okay, so then anybody who lives in Moscow and is a Jew is extraordinary? And to the doctor point, this is also in the book, but when I say this, the following statistic, American audiences go, 70% of Soviet doctors were women. But they worked in the least glamorous, lowest paid, worst parts of the job, of the field. They were the primary care doctors, the gynecologists, the pediatricians. They got paid nothing. They were worked to the bone. The other 30% were the tertiary care specialists, the surgeons, the hospital administrators, the people who did the sexy research, all men. And medicine and a career in medicine didn't have quite the same prestige in the Soviet Union and in Russia, where it's still a very low-paid profession, that it does in the US. And do you know why? Because it was full of women. Because once a profession becomes feminized, it becomes far less lucrative and far less prestigious. So I'll tell you a funny story. An American man, on hearing from my dad that what my parents did in the Soviet Union, said, "Oh, wow, your wife was a doctor and you were a computer programmer. You guys must have lived very well." And he said, "No, together our salaries were less than that of one bus driver." Because the class hierarchy was a little bit upside down also. But yeah, I think, again, let's resist kind of projecting American hierarchies, American ideas onto this very weird society. What's that? Yeah, but our Jewish family was not very different from millions of other Jewish families. I just, like, there was a lot of tragedy and a lot of humor, and we didn't, like most Soviet Jewish families, we didn't know anything about the religion itself. It was mostly an ethnic and cultural identity until we moved to the US. And I think, again, when I hear people like you or many, many other Soviet Jews or people who have that, those roots tell me, "Oh, I see my family in this," that tells me, yes, my people, not that they were like nobody. I mean, I don't know how to put it, like they were ordinary. There's nothing bad about being ordinary. But it was a weird place. It was the craziest social experiment, I think, ever conducted by humans. In that context, we were pretty ordinary.
I want to take a different tact about the ordinariness or non-ordinariness of your family. You and I talk about our grandmothers a lot. Mm-hmm. And I know that your grandmother, one of them specifically, but your grandmother has figured prominently into not only the book, but the process of writing the book. And I've heard you talk about them And not because they were doctors, but because they were Jewish doctors in Moscow, but they've always seemed pretty extraordinary to me. And I know that they were an important part of this book. And so I'm curious if you could talk about who they were, how they figured into the process of your writing the book, and like, when you were reporting in Russia, where were they? Because I think it's just a fun beat.
Yeah, I should say they were extraordinary to me, right? But the one who stayed in Moscow was a cardiologist, and the one who came here 2 years after us was a chemical engineer, and she oversaw the lab in Rublevo, just outside of Moscow, that oversaw the drinking water going into parts of Moscow as well as the Kremlin to make sure it was clean and potable. And somebody recently joked like, "Oh, missed opportunity there." So they were incredibly, incredibly different. And in interviewing them, I found them both to be insanely frustrating. My Moscow grandmother was, like many people in her generation, and I think by character, a bit of a narcissist. And so everything was about how wonderful she was and how everyone loved her, and how her time when her mother was a doctor in like the children's penal colony in Novosibirsk, how it was actually so wonderful because she had this amazing teacher from Leningrad who was a political prisoner, but she recognized my grandmother's many talents, and I was like, this is not helpful. I need more facts, Grandma. And then the other grandmother, the one here in the US, who sadly passed away at the age of 96 in February, she was impossible because she was like, I don't remember. But my neighbor's cousin, he was married to this woman, and she came from this village, and in that village there was a woman. And then like half an hour later, I'm like, what the fuck are we talking about right now? And so I would go and complain to my parents, and I was like, could you have given me one normal grandmother? Like, can you combine them? Because they're both impossible interview subjects. But I love them both, and I miss them both a lot, and they were obviously extraordinary to me. My point was that they weren't celebrities, they weren't historical figures, they were products of their time and their place.
Well, just to close, I think one of the amazing things about this book is that I think in general, but especially in the West, we have a tendency to lean into this like hero myth. And I think some of that is a gender thing, but this notion of extraordinary people triumphing in extraordinary times. And personally, I find more heroism in ordinary folks just surviving. And I think this story it valorizes people who have historically been excluded from the historical record, and it is an extraordinary chronicle that I'm just very glad exists, and I'm so proud that I'm friends with the person who wrote it.
Thank you.
So,
I do just want to say that is what so drew me to Alexievich's books. And if you haven't read them, do. Because it is, as she said, her job was to chronicle the little people living through big history. And what you read and what you see when you encounter this, and this is something that Brandon Jacobs-Jenkins and I have talked about, she has been an influence on his work as well, is that there's incredible heroism in survival, but also people are incredible narrators of their own lives and can be quite poetic and notice the metaphors, the accidents, that basically ordinary people are also poets and incredible, chroniclers of their own lives and times if you just listen.
One last thing. There's a massive absence on the cover of this book, which is that it is a finalist for the National Book Award for nonfiction. Personally, I'm waiting to get mine signed when it's got the official thing on there. But it was nominated before it even came out, which I don't think is really a thing that happens. Which I think again just reflects just how good it is. I'm just shilling at this point, but you should absolutely buy a copy of the book and get it signed outside. Thank you all for coming. Let's give Julia another round of applause.